They said the salt tasted wrong that morning. Not just bitter, but intimate, as if the mine had already been inside their mouths before they ever stepped underground. In the Wieliczka salt mine, workers swore the carvings changed after every shift. Saint smiled a little wider. Eyes shifted closer to the paths of the living. And when one master laughed at their fear, he was found the next day sealed inside the wall, perfectly preserved in salt, wearing an expression no one could name. Terror, joy, or recognition. The mine never explained. It only kept carving. The first thing they noticed was the taste, arriving before thought, before fear, before memory could arrange itself into meaning. Salt coated the tongue without permission, sharp and metallic, as if the mouth had bitten into a wound hidden inside the air itself. It lingered stubbornly on the teeth, in the throat, in the back of the skull, refusing to dissolve, a reminder that the mind did not wait to be touched in order to touch back. Lamps burned low in the depths of Wieliczka, their flames thin and yellow, bending sideways as though the tunnels exhaled with slow, deliberate breaths. The air felt used, breathed too many times, heavy with dust so fine it slipped past nostrils and settled directly into the lungs, rasping with every inhale. The walls glistened as if damp, though no water ran there, only salt polished smooth by centuries of hands and backs and tools. Saints emerged from the crystal, carved in devotion and obedience, their robes frozen mid-fold, their fingers lifted in gestures of blessing that never reached completion. Light caught their faces too precisely, sliding along cheekbones and eyelids in ways that suggested intention rather than accident. Eyes reflected the lamps at angles that felt wrong, as if the carvings had subtly shifted after the men passed, turning themselves just enough to watch. Footsteps echoed strangely, each sound returning softened, delayed, altered, as though the mind repeated them after consideration. Pickaxes rang against the walls with clean, brittle notes, and each strike sent a vibration through the floor that traveled upward into the legs, into the spine, a faint trembling that lingered longer than it should have. Salt dust floated constantly, glittering in lamplight like suspended frost, settling into hair, into sleeves, into the corners of mouths. By the time the men reached the deeper chambers, their skin tasted of it, their sweat turned white where it dried. There were places where the tunnel narrowed unexpectedly, where the ceiling pressed low and the walls curved inward, forcing bodies to twist sideways, ribs brushing cold crystal. In those passages, the air felt thicker, almost viscous, clinging to skin and breath alike. Lamps dimmed there without reason, flames shrinking as if starved, and the carved figures grew more numerous, their faces closer together, packed tightly into the salt as though the stone itself had once been crowded. No one remembered when the carvings had first begun to feel different. There was no single moment, no shared realization, only the gradual sense that something subtle had shifted. A saint's mouth seemed slightly more curved than before, not enough to be named a smile, but enough to unsettle. A martyr's eyes appeared less lifted toward heaven and more level, more attentive, catching movement along the tunnels. The mine had always been old, older than any man working within it, but now its age felt active, present, aware. By the end of the shift, when lamps were turned back toward the surface and muscles burned with familiar exhaustion, the taste of salt still clung stubbornly to the mouth. It followed the men upward, refusing to be swallowed away, as if the mine had marked them from the inside, reminding them that once they had breathed its depths, some part of them would remain listening below. By the middle of the century, when the mine had already outlived kings, bishops, and the names of those who first cut into its veins, the men began to notice that memory itself had grown unreliable underground. They would pass a relief at the start of a shift, its features familiar, almost comforting in their stiffness, and return hours later to find something subtly altered. A saint's mouth curved a little higher than it had that morning, not enough to call it a smile, but enough to suggest awareness. A martyr's brow folded inward, the lines sharper, less pious, carrying a tension that had not been there before. The folds of carved robes seemed tighter, drawn closer to the bodies beneath them, like fabric pulled over muscle rather than stone shaped by tools. At first, The changes were dismissed as fatigue. The mind punished the eyes as much as the back, grinding down certainty with dust and darkness. Salt dust filled the air constantly, dry and rasping, coating lashes and settling into the corners of vision until shapes blurred and edges softened. Lamps flickered, their light uneven, and shadows slid across walls in slow, uncertain motions. It was easy to believe that tired minds filled gaps, that fear crept in where confidence failed. Yet the certainty returned every time the men retraced their paths, guided by memory rather than marks, and found that the walls did not agree with what they remembered. Footsteps echoed differently now. Sound traveled along the tunnels with a slight hesitation, returning a fraction too late, as if the mind paused to listen before answering. The echoes were not weaker, merely altered, softened at the edges, shaped by curves and chambers in ways that felt intentional. In the deeper galleries, where ceilings arched low and the walls pressed close, the echoes sometimes returned from the wrong direction, brushing the spine with unease. Men slowed their pace there, unconsciously matching the mind's rhythm, their breathing shallow, their movements careful, as if speed itself might offend something unseen. The carvings multiplied without record. No ledger accounted for them. No master claimed responsibility. New faces appeared in niches that had been bare the day before, their features rendered with unsettling precision. Cheeks bore the faint suggestion of warmth. Noses caught the lamplight with a softness that felt almost alive. When touched, the salt remained cold, unforgiving, yet the impression lingered that the stone resisted, that it remembered pressure and returned it in kind. Hands came away white, dusted, marked by the mind's signature. Stories began to circulate in fragments, shared in low voices at the edge of hearing. One man claimed a saint's eyes had followed him through an entire corridor, shifting only when he stopped to test the illusion. Another swore a carved king had changed his expression between breaths, jaw tightening, lips thinning, as though displeased at being observed too closely. Laughter followed these tales, forced and brittle, echoing unnaturally against the salt walls. The mind swallowed the sound quickly, leaving behind an uncomfortable silence. There were places the men avoided now, small side chambers where reliefs crowded together too tightly, their faces angled inward, as if engaged in some private attention. The air in those chambers felt stale, heavier than elsewhere, carrying a faint, sour tang beneath the salt, reminiscent of old sweat trapped in cloth. Lamps dimmed faster there, wicks burning down without cause, flames shrinking until shadows claimed more space than light. When someone had to pass through, they did so quickly, eyes fixed forward, tools held close, unwilling to linger. The sense of being watched grew steadily, not sudden enough to spark panic, but constant enough to erode certainty. It crept along the back of the neck, settled between the shoulders, a pressure that did not lift even when the tunnels widened. Carved eyes reflected lamplight too sharply, catching and holding it, and sometimes the reflection appeared where no lamp stood. The mind seemed to store light, releasing it slowly, selectively, illuminating details no one remembered carving. Time behaved differently below. Shifts stretched or compressed without warning, hours dissolving into a continuous labor marked only by muscle fatigue and the slow drip of sweat down spines. Men emerged convinced they had worked far longer than they had, or unsettled by how quickly exhaustion arrived. Above ground, daylight felt thin and distant, as though filtered through layers of crystal. The taste of salt lingered even then, clinging to lips and throats, a reminder that the mind did not release what it had claimed so easily. The reliefs themselves began to suggest repetition. Certain faces appeared again and again, scattered across different chambers, their expressions nearly identical. A particular curve of the mouth, a familiar crease beside the eye, surfaced in places too far apart to be coincidence. Some men felt a flicker of recognition that made no sense, a sense that they had seen these faces somewhere else, sometime else, though no memory followed. The mind offered no answers, only more surfaces, more carvings, more silence. At night, sleep grew shallow. Dreams filled with white corridors and pressing walls, with faces emerging from crystal, lips moving without sound. Waking brought no relief, only the awareness that the dreams lacked imagination, that they merely repeated what the mind had already shown. In the mornings, before descending again, men scrubbed their hands raw, trying to rid themselves of the fine residue that lingered beneath nails and in the creases of skin. It returned regardless, as if carried upward by breath alone. By the time fear found words, it had already taken root. The mind had become something other than a place of labor. It felt deliberate, patient, attentive. The reliefs no longer seemed passive, no longer merely decorations carved in devotion or pride. They felt like records, like impressions taken from the living and preserved in salt. And each day, as the men passed beneath those watching faces, they could not shake the growing certainty that the mind was not changing by accident, but by accumulation, learning the shapes of those who moved through it, waiting for something more than labor to be left behind. There was one master carver who treated the mind as it had always been treated, as material and nothing more. His boots struck the salt floor with deliberate weight, loud enough to announce his presence long before his lamp came into view, and his laughter followed him down the tunnels like a challenge thrown into the dark. His hands were thick with scars, old white lines crossing the skin where crystal had bitten too deep in younger years, proof of skill earned through pain rather than patience. He trusted those hands completely. They had shaped saints whose faces pilgrims kissed, kings whose likenesses were praised for their authority, angels whose wings unfurled from salt as cleanly as if they had grown there. To him, the walls were obedient. Stone yielded to pressure, to angle, to repetition. Anything else was weakness dressed as superstition. He chose his places carefully, favoring wide chambers where the ceiling arched high and the walls offered long, uninterrupted stretches of crystal. There, the salt gleamed white and translucent, catching lamplight and scattering it in soft halos that made the space feel almost holy. He worked with a steady rhythm, each strike measured, each pause intentional, breath matching the rise and fall of his arm. Chips fell like snow at his feet, crunching under his boots, and the air filled with the familiar rasp of disturbed crystal. The mind accepted this treatment without complaint. It did not tremble, did not resist. It simply absorbed the noise, the vibration, the heat of his body. Around him, other men worked more cautiously, their movements smaller, their glances quick and frequent. They avoided carving faces now, preferring patterns, pillars, anything that did not require eyes or mouths. The master noticed and dismissed it with a flick of his gaze. Fear, he believed, dulled craftsmanship. It made hands uncertain and lines crooked. He carved faces deliberately, confidently, setting chisel to stone with a precision that bordered on defiance. Angels emerged beneath his hands, their expressions serene and distant, untouched by the unease that had crept into the mind. Kings followed, stern and immovable, their gazes fixed forward, their mouths set in unyielding lines. The mind answered him with silence, so complete it felt heavy. Sound seemed to die more quickly around him, swallowed before it could echo properly. The ringing of his chisel faded too fast, leaving an unnatural quiet that pressed against the ears, filling the space between heartbeats. It was not the absence of noise that unsettled the others, but its quality, as though the mind listened so intently that it left no room for anything else. The master noticed this too, though he refused to name it. Silence, like stone, could be shaped by expectation. He expected nothing. Behind him, the carvings caught the warmth he left behind. Where his lamp passed, the salt seemed to glow faintly longer than it should have, retaining a ghost of light that clung to edges and contours. Faces he had finished hours earlier appeared more defined when revisited, shadows settling into lines with unfamiliar emphasis. A cheekbone seemed sharper, an eyelid heavier. The changes were subtle, easily attributed to shifting light or tired eyes, and the master dismissed them with irritation rather than fear. He trusted his memory of the work more than what the wall suggested. As days passed, his productivity increased. He carved faster, more assured, his movements economical and exact. The mind provided flawless surfaces, veins of salt aligning conveniently with the forms he intended, crystal breaking cleanly where he struck. It felt like collaboration rather than resistance. He began to work longer than others, lingering after shifts ended, lamp turned low, the rest of the mind emptied of movement. In those hours, the silence deepened further, becoming almost tangible, a pressure that rested on shoulders and spine. It did not interrupt him. It watched. The faces he carved during those solitary hours carried a different quality. They were not planned, not sketched in the mind before the first strike. They emerged intuitively, guided by muscle memory and instinct rather than design. An angel's smile grew narrower than intended. A king's gaze sharpened, pupils carved deeper, shadows pooling within them even under full lamplight. The master felt no hesitation as he worked, no doubt. His hands moved with certainty, guided by something that felt older than training, older even than experience. When he stepped back to examine the results, he felt a brief flicker of unfamiliar satisfaction, sharper and colder than pride. The mind seemed closer to him now. Walls pressed in subtly, not enough to impede movement, but enough to be felt, a narrowing of space that followed him from chamber to chamber. The air carried more dust, finer than before, coating skin in a thin, pale film that clung stubbornly even after washing. He tasted salt constantly, on his lips, on his tongue, in the back of his throat, as if the mind had begun to circulate through him rather than around him. Sleep brought no relief. Dreams filled with white corridors and unfinished faces, their features smooth and blank until his hands approached, until detail rushed in all at once. Others noticed changes in him before he did. His posture stiffened, his movements more angular, less forgiving. He stood closer to the walls when resting, one shoulder often brushing crystal unconsciously, as if drawn there. His gaze lingered longer on finished carvings, studying them with an intensity that bordered on scrutiny. When he laughed now, the sound was shorter, sharper, cutting off abruptly rather than echoing. The mind absorbed it instantly, leaving nothing behind. There were moments, brief and easily ignored, when he felt watched not by the carvings, but by the space between them. In wide chambers, where reliefs lined the walls at intervals, the gaps seemed charged, dense with attention. Lamps dimmed slightly in those spaces, their flames steady but smaller, as if conserving something. The master responded by working harder, striking faster, filling empty stretches of wall with new forms. Each face added seemed to ease the pressure, to restore balance, and he took this as confirmation of his control. Yet the carvings behind his back continued to lean inward. It was not a movement that could be caught in the act, not something that could be proven. It was an impression carried in the body rather than the eye, a sense of proximity where none should exist. When he turned suddenly, expecting to catch the illusion in motion, everything appeared as it should have been. Stone was stone. Faces were still. Only the silence remained, pressing close, attentive, complete. By the time exhaustion finally forced him upward toward the surface each day, he carried the mind with him. Salt dust marked his skin and clothes more heavily than before, gathering in the lines of his face, whitening the creases around his mouth and eyes. In the fading light near the entrance, his reflection in a polished crystal surface startled him with its intensity. For a moment, he did not recognize the expression staring back, the focus too sharp, the mouth too firmly set. Then the moment passed, dismissed like every other warning the mind had offered, and he had ignored. The shift ended without ceremony, the way most things did underground, not with a signal, but with exhaustion asserting itself all at once. Lamps began to sputter as if the air itself had thickened beyond their tolerance, flames shrinking, wavering, pulling low toward the wicks. Cold seeped into the tunnels, not the clean chill of stone, but something heavier, damp, carrying the faint odor of wet mineral and old sweat trapped in fabric too long worn. Breath fogged briefly before mouths, then vanished, swallowed by the salt-lined corridors. Tools were gathered in silence, their metal dull and chalked white, and boots dragged toward the ascent with a weariness that felt deeper than muscle. No one saw the master leave. No one heard his boots behind them, no familiar weight of sound marking his passage through the tunnels. At the time, this absence meant nothing. He often stayed longer than others, chasing the last clean line, the last perfect curve. The mind allowed such things. It remembered. Morning returned them reluctantly to the depths. Lamps were relit, smoke curling upward and staining the ceiling with fresh shadows, and the descent felt steeper than usual, the ladders longer, the air more resistant. Salt dust already hung suspended, unmoving, as though the mine had not exhaled since the previous night. The tunnels were quiet in a way that felt complete, not merely empty but closed, sealed off from expectation. They found him in a corridor none of them could immediately place. It branched off a familiar passage, narrow and sharply angled, its walls too smooth, too uniform, as if freshly shaped. There had been no niche there the day before. Of that, they were certain. The salt remembered its own contours too well to be mistaken. The master was embedded in the wall from waist to crown, his legs still free, boots resting on the floor as though he had stepped forward and been gently, impossibly accepted by the stone. Translucent salt sealed him in place, layered thickly over his torso and arms, fusing cloth, skin, and crystal into a single surface. The salt was clear enough to reveal him beneath, yet dense enough to deny access, light bending strangely as it passed through, distorting edges, softening outlines. His skin bore a brittle glaze, pale and matte, cracked and fine, branching lines like winter earth after a hard frost. Where sweat had once darkened his collar, salt now bloomed outward in crystalline patterns, delicate and sharp. His hands, those scarred instruments of certainty, were pressed flat against the interior surface, fingers splayed slightly, not in struggle, but in contact, as if feeling the wall rather than resisting it. No blood marked the stone. There was no sign of violence, no rupture, no indication of force applied from without. The face stopped them. Lamps were raised instinctively, light drawn closer, breaths held without conscious decision. His expression was exacting in its detail, carved with a precision no human hand could have achieved in flesh. The muscles of his jaw were set, neither clenched nor slack. His eyes were open, focused, pupils clear, directed not outward but inward, fixed on something only he could see. The mouth hovered between shapes, corners neither lifted nor drawn down, caught in a moment that refused interpretation. No one could agree on what it showed. Some felt the cold certainty of terror radiating from it, a recognition of something vast and inescapable. Others sensed delight, sharp and private, the satisfaction of comprehension finally achieved. A few spoke later of recognition, the expression of a man seeing something long familiar at last revealed in full. The mind offered no clarification. It held the face steady, unchanging, perfect. They touched the salt cautiously. It was cold, unyielding, its surface smooth and newly formed, lacking the scratches and dullness of worked stone. Tools raised against it failed immediately. Picks skidded, chisels rang and slipped away, leaving no mark. Each strike echoed too loudly, too cleanly, reverberating down the corridor in harsh, accusing tones. The sound returned altered, flattened, as if absorbed, and returned without warmth. As they worked, the air grew heavier still. Lamps dimmed despite fresh wicks. Shadows clung to the edges of the niche, gathering in the narrow space around the embedded body, deepening the sense that the wall was not merely a surface but a boundary. Sweat ran cold down spines. The familiar taste of salt intensified, coating tongues, settling into throats until swallowing became a conscious effort. The corridor itself seemed wrong. Its angles felt too deliberate, its proportions too precise, as if it had been shaped with intention rather than cut through necessity. The walls bore no marks of excavation, no tool scars, no signs of labor. They were as smooth as the reliefs the master had carved, their surfaces catching light in the same soft, attentive way. It was impossible to say where his work had ended and the mine's had begun. Eventually, they stopped trying to free him, not because they agreed, but because the mine made continuation feel inappropriate, almost intrusive. A pressure settled into the chest, subtle but insistent, discouraging further effort. Hands lowered. Tools were set aside. Silence reclaimed the space quickly, wrapping around the niche, sealing it off from disturbance. They backed away slowly, eyes fixed on the face until distance and shadow softened its details. Even then, the sense of being watched persisted, following them back into wider tunnels, into the familiar chambers that now felt altered by proximity alone. The mind had not taken him violently. It had not broken him. It had accepted him, incorporated him, preserved him with the same care it showed its carvings. Words spread upward, carried in fragments, stripped of certainty. Above ground, the story grew sharper, more grotesque, but underground, the truth remained quieter, heavier. The niche was marked, avoided, yet never sealed. Lamps placed near it dimmed faster than elsewhere, their light bending inward toward the embedded form. Salt continued to bloom slowly along the edges, thickening, smoothing, integrating him further with each passing day. Those who passed felt compelled to glance toward the wall, to measure their own expressions against the one held there. Some thought they saw changes over time, slight shifts in tension around the eyes, minute adjustments in the mouth. Others swore it never changed at all, that it remained fixed in that precise moment of understanding. The mind did not confirm either belief. It only held him, patient and silent, as it held everything given to it, and the corridors around the niche seemed to narrow imperceptibly, guiding footsteps closer whether the living wished it or not. After that, the mind changed its habits, not abruptly, not in a way that invited immediate panic, but with the slow confidence of something that no longer needed to hide its intent. The first sign was absence. Tools left leaning against walls were found coated in a thin, even layer of salt by the next descent, as if time had passed more densely around them. Marks made the previous day softened overnight, edges blurring, lines losing definition, until it became difficult to tell where labor had ended and untouched stone had begun. New carvings appeared without warning. There were no chisel scars, no fractures radiating from a point of impact, no debris at their feet. Faces simply emerged from the walls as if they had always been there, waiting for the light to find them. Their mouths were drawn thin, precise, curved not in joy or cruelty, but in understanding. The kind of expression worn by someone who had learned something irreversible and found it sufficient. Their eyes were angled deliberately, not toward altars or imagined heavens, but toward the paths the living used most, following the flow of bodies through the tunnels with unsettling accuracy. The workers felt watched from every direction, not only from the walls ahead or behind, but from below their boots and above the low ceilings, from within the salt itself. The sensation was not sharp enough to be called fear at first. It was intimate, persistent, like pressure on the skin that never quite lifted. The mind no longer felt empty between shifts. It felt occupied. The salt changed under their hands. Where it had once been cold and inert, it now carried a faint warmth, subtle but unmistakable, especially in deeper chambers. Palms pressed against the walls felt a residual heat, as though the stone remembered bodies that had leaned there, breaths that had fogged the air, hands that had shaped and struck and rested. The warmth lingered longer than it should have, fading slowly, reluctantly, as if unwilling to let go of what it had absorbed. Dust behaved strangely. It no longer settled randomly, no longer scattered evenly across the floor. Instead, it gathered into impressions that resembled footprints, overlapping paths that did not correspond to the number of men who had entered. Some sets were too small, some too narrow, others oddly elongated, as if shaped by weight distributed differently than flesh allowed. These impressions appeared overnight, sharp-edged and undisturbed, leading into side passages no one remembered using, stopping abruptly before blank walls. The workers began to count themselves more often. At the start of shifts, at the end, during pauses in wide chambers where they could see one another clearly. The numbers always matched, yet the unease remained. It felt as though the mind carried an extra presence that did not need to be accounted for, something that moved without disturbing air, without leaving marks except where it chose to. Sound shifted again. Echoes shortened, cut off before completing themselves. Sometimes they did not return at all. Other times, they came back altered, layered, as if multiple spaces were answering at once. A dropped tool might ring out twice, the second sound softer, closer, as though the stone itself had attempted imitation. The mind seemed to practice. Faces multiplied. They appeared in clusters now, arranged with unsettling intention. Some were half-formed, features emerging from salt like thoughts interrupted, mouths smooth and closed, eyes shallow depressions catching shadow. Others were finished with extraordinary care, their expressions subtle, restrained, deeply familiar. Certain workers felt an unexplainable pull toward particular carvings, drawn by a resemblance they refused to acknowledge. Lamps lingered there longer, flames steadying as if comforted. No one carved faces anymore. The decision was unspoken but universal. Hands avoided those shapes instinctively, turning instead to columns, arches, simple patterns that repeated without meaning. Even then, the mind intervened. Decorative lines warped slightly between shifts. Symmetry failed where it had been precise. The walls corrected work without asking, smoothing, adjusting, refining. It was impossible to tell whether these changes were improvements or mockery. Sleep became fractured. Dreams bled into waking hours, leaving behind fragments that clung stubbornly to thought. Corridors stretched endlessly, lined with faces that turned in unison. Hands pressed into walls that yielded like skin before hardening again. Waking brought no clarity, only the sense that rest had been observed as closely as labor. The embedded master became a point of gravity. Though no one spoke of him directly anymore, paths curved subtly toward his niche. Lamps dimmed nearby, then brightened again once passed, as if acknowledging a boundary. The salt around him thickened, smoothing over the edges of his form, erasing distinctions between body and wall. His face remained visible, however, preserved with unwavering precision. Some swore it had changed, that the tension had softened, the focus sharpened. Others insisted it was exactly the same, accusing memory rather than stone. The mind grew efficient. Accidents decreased, strangely. Collapses did not occur. Supports held longer than expected. Tools lasted. It was as though the space itself anticipated stress and redistributed it, compensating in ways that defied experience. This efficiency felt earned rather than gifted, extracted rather than offered freely. The sense of exchange settled heavily over the work. Those who lingered alone reported sensations they struggled to describe. A brush of pressure along the arm, a sudden warmth at the back of the neck. The impression of standing too close to someone unseen. Turning revealed nothing. The walls remained still. Faces remained fixed. Yet the sensation did not fade. It followed. Above ground, the men grew quieter. Salt crusted their clothing more thickly than before, blooming along seams and cuffs even after washing. Their skin dried and cracked despite ointments, fine white lines spreading like the fractures on the master's glazed flesh. They avoided mirrors without naming the reason. In reflections caught accidentally, they sometimes thought they saw something else looking back, an intensity that felt borrowed. The mind did not hurry. It allowed the days to pass, allowed habits to settle into this new arrangement. It watched the living adjust, recalibrate, accept. New carvings continued to appear, each one placed where it would be seen, where its gaze would intersect with movement. The paths narrowed imperceptibly, guiding bodies closer to the walls, closer to the watching faces. By then, no one doubted that the mind had learned something essential. It no longer waited to be shaped. It shaped in return, and the salt, warm beneath the hand, patient and enduring, held every trace it gathered, preparing for whatever exchange would come next. Years later, long after the men who had first noticed the changes were reduced to names in parish books or forgotten entirely, the mind was spoken of with reverence. It was praised as a triumph of human devotion and endurance, a cathedral carved not upward toward heaven but inward, into the patience of the earth itself. Guides led visitors down the familiar routes, lamps now steadier, corridors widened and reinforced, the danger carefully curated into something safe enough to admire. The air still tasted of salt, but no one remarked on it. It was expected. It belonged. Visitors moved slowly, their footsteps cautious, their voices hushed by the scale of what surrounded them. They marveled at the lifelike reliefs, at the astonishing precision with which faces emerged from crystal, expressions captured in moments of prayer, authority, humility. Lamps traced gentle arcs of light across cheeks and brows, bringing out subtle details that drew murmurs of awe. Fingers brushed the walls despite warnings, lingering just long enough to feel the smoothness, the faint, deceptive warmth that vanished the moment attention shifted. They did not taste the bitterness beneath their tongues. It lingered there quietly, unnoticed, dismissed as dryness, as imagination. They swallowed and moved on, unaware that the sensation matched exactly what the miners had once felt, what they had learned to recognize as the mind's first and most intimate greeting. The faces blended together for those who did not know how to look. Saints and kings, martyrs and unnamed figures, all arranged in careful harmony along the corridors. Yet to eyes trained by familiarity, patterns emerged. Many mouths shared the same subtle curve, neither smile nor frown, an expression balanced on the edge of understanding. It repeated too often to be coincidence, appearing in different chambers, on different figures, carved in different styles. The guide spoke of artistic schools, of apprentices imitating masters, of tradition passed hand to hand. No one questioned why that particular expression endured. The eyes were more difficult to dismiss, though few noticed them consciously. They were angled with precision, not fixed outward toward imagined congregations, but aligned with the flow of movement through the mind. Wherever visitors walked, wherever they paused, there were faces positioned to observe them, their gazes intersecting paths with quiet consistency. Lamps reflected sharply in carved pupils, giving the illusion of life, of awareness sparked momentarily by light. Cameras captured this effect and amplified it, flashes freezing reflections into something that felt almost intentional. Deep within the mine, beyond the routes most commonly shown, a newer carving rested half-hidden in a narrow corridor. It was not marked on maps, not included in speeches, but it existed all the same, shaped with a care that surpassed even the most celebrated works. The face it bore was unmistakable to anyone who had known him, though such people were long gone. It was the likeness of the last man who had doubted openly, the one whose disbelief had been loud enough to echo before the mind learned how to answer. His features were rendered with unnerving accuracy. The set of the jaw, the slight asymmetry of the eyes, the faint tension around the mouth that had once accompanied his laughter. That mouth now held the familiar curve, restrained and knowing, identical to so many others scattered throughout the depths. The salt around the face was smooth and luminous, free of tool marks, as if it had crystallized into that form by choice rather than force. Few visitors ever reached that corridor. Those who did felt an inexplicable urge to stop there, to linger longer than intended. Lamps dimmed slightly in that space, shadows gathering closer, making the relief seem to lean forward without moving. Some felt a pressure behind the eyes, a sudden awareness of their own expressions, of how their faces might look if fixed in stone at that precise moment. They shifted uncomfortably and moved on, laughing softly, unaware of why their hearts beat faster. Time passed differently in the mine, though no one spoke of it that way anymore. Seasons changed above ground, regimes rose and fell, language itself softened and reshaped. Yet below, the salt remained constant. It absorbed light, sound, warmth, holding each patiently. The embedded master was still there, sealed deep within his niche, now part of the official history, though stripped of its unease. Guides described him as a tragic accident, a cautionary tale, his face framed by careful lighting that softened its intensity. Visitors nodded, satisfied by explanation, unwilling to linger on the precision of that expression. The mind listened. It listened to footsteps, to breaths, to the subtle variations in movement that distinguished one body from another. It listened to hands pressed against walls, to backs leaning briefly into alcoves, to the quiet heat left behind by living presence. Each trace was recorded not as memory but as structure, integrated into crystal with infinite patience. New carvings continued to appear, though no one officially acknowledged their arrival. They were discovered gradually, folded into tours, attributed to forgotten artisans. Each one bore the same careful attention to detail, the same unsettling familiarity. Faces multiplied quietly, their expressions restrained, consistent, evolving towards something ever more refined. Above, the mine's reputation grew. It was celebrated in books, in lectures, in carefully framed illustrations. It became a symbol of perseverance, of human will imposed upon nature. The narrative was repeated until it settled into certainty. Below, the salt accepted this story without resistance. It had learned long ago that belief shaped behavior more effectively than fear. Beneath the lamps, beyond the reach of admiration and explanation, the mind remained attentive. It waited as it always had, not for devotion, not for labor alone, but for contact, for the warmth of hands resting against crystal, for the subtle impressions left by bodies moving through space. It did not hurry. It did not need to. The salt listened, patient and eternal, holding every trace it was given, preparing quietly for the moment when another pair of hands would linger too long, when another expression would be noticed too late, and when the mind would once again decide that what it observed was worth keeping forever.